title, Broken Piano Melody. On the day I held the ultrasound results in my hand, my heart overflowing with joy, I also received the news that he and that girl were holding an engagement ceremony. He said it was her last wish before leaving this world. And me? What am I in this relationship? I realized that the 10 years of my youth I gave him were nothing compared to a single tear from that girl. As Hong placed the engagement ring on Nok's finger, the small room filled with applause. The atmosphere was warm as he lifted her white veil. Finally, I saw the girl he cherished. Nok, in her pristine white dress, was breathtakingly beautiful. I felt ashamed. Cheers rang out. Kiss her. Kiss her. Nok tiptoed and puckered her lips. Hong seemed hesitant, finally placing a light kiss on her cheek. Just then, he saw me under the willow tree. It was a ceremony held in a small church, bringing some warmth and romance to the otherwise quiet place. And the man who once said he loved me for life, the boyfriend who promised me a perfect wedding, was now holding someone else's hand, pledging lifelong vows to them. I stood there, stunned, my hands and feet icy cold. A gust of wind passed, carrying a biting chill. The ceremony was forced to pause because of my presence. Who's that? What is she doing here? She can't be a crasher, she can't compare to the bride. All eyes were on me. They frowned, disapproving, as if I were the villain, breaking up this perfect love story. Nok also saw me. She slightly frowned, looking like a perfect sculpture. Hong panicked, let go of her hand, and ran towards me. Ha, wait! Nok grabbed his arm, tears welling up, looking at me with pity. Hong, this ceremony can't go on without the groom. The calm and decisive man hesitated. He looked at me, but his body leaned towards Nok. What else was I waiting for? Waiting any longer would only be self-deprecation. He wouldn't choose me. I turned and walked away. Ha! Hong took a few steps towards me. A hoarse voice rang out behind him, Nok. Chaos ensued. He still didn't catch up to me. All night, I didn't sleep. Hong didn't come back either. Our message interface still held the last message, Hong, when you get back, I have a surprise for you. Little did I know, he had given me a huge surprise first. The day I found out I was pregnant, the man I loved held someone else's hand and walked down the aisle. I thought he was on a business trip. I thought he was too busy to reply to messages. But he was busy getting married. My waiting and surprises, everything I did, became a joke. The crumpled test results were no longer needed. When I met Hong, he had just broken up with Nok. His career and love life had collapsed. And my appearance? It was just a coincidence. I brought him comfort and encouragement. I accompanied him from his lows to his highs, for 10 long years. 10 years later, he said he wanted to marry me. I thought it was out of gratitude or guilt. But he said, I don't know when it started, but my eyes were only on you, and since then, I couldn't look away. In that moment, I couldn't describe my emotions. The truth was, he didn't know. Long ago, he had left a mark on my heart. It was me, always chasing his shadow. And that day, my unrequited love finally blossomed. I thought I could clear the clouds and see the moonlight. That's what I thought. But Nok's appearance shattered all my illusions. It was just self-deception. He never forgot her. As the last light faded from the sky, I decided to leave. As soon as I finished packing my suitcase, there was a commotion outside the door. Hong came in, looking tired. Ha, that ceremony was out of my hands. I looked at him silently, not saying a word. Nok has congenital heart disease, and she wanted to be a bride one last time. In that moment, was his pain because of my lack of understanding or Nok's imminent decline? I couldn't tell. Probably the latter. He rarely felt sad because of me. Today I went to see her, she was wearing a wedding dress, asking me to accompany her through the upcoming stages. An indescribable sadness lingered on his furrowed brow. Ha, I couldn't refuse, she's dying. Refuse? Did he ever consider refusing? At the ceremony, his smile couldn't be faked. He married the one he had longed for in his youth. He had dreamed of marrying her. I asked him, when did she come back? Was it the day we went ring shopping? In fact, everything was traceable. That day, he received a phone call. Normally calm and self-possessed, especially with his career soaring over these past years, he rarely showed his emotions. But that day, he suddenly seemed distracted. There was a sadness and urgency in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. He said there was an urgent work issue. I believed him. Later, he went on a business trip for a few days. When he returned, he was often lost in thought. During that time, I always tried my best to cheer him up. I really thought he was facing a difficult problem and I hoped I could share his worries. But it turned out, he was worrying about another woman. I asked him, were you with her during those days you were away on a business trip? He was silent. He never bothered to lie to me, but ultimately he made an exception for Knock. I suddenly realized that I seemed to no longer recognize him. But those features, his calm eyes, his indifferent lips, all unmistakably belonged to him. I chuckled self-deprecatingly, Hong, forget it. He didn't respond, standing in front of me, steadfast and unmoving. His lips were tightly pressed together. His Adam's apple bobbed, as if he had something to say. But he said nothing. I pushed the suitcase, preparing to go past him and leave. However, he grabbed my wrist, his brows furrowed, his voice hoarse, don't go. I shook off his hand. I went to the hospital for a checkup and scheduled surgery. Just as I arrived downstairs, I met Knock. She smiled warmly at me, introducing herself openly. Hello, I'm Knock. She was a pianist, graceful and beautiful. Standing next to her, the contrast was clear. When Hong faced career failure, she decisively left him to study abroad. Perhaps people always yearn for what they can't have. The unattainable always seems the best. That's why Hong had longed for her all these years. And someone like me, rushing in, naturally wouldn't earn his cherish. Hong told me, you are his fiancé, she said, with a raised chin and a wry smile. She was clearly showing off. Being a fiancé, so what? He's still holding a wedding ceremony with her. She resorted to the same trick. It was stupid, but effective. I felt a surge in my stomach. I turned and ran to the restroom at the end of the corridor, vomiting until I was dizzy. It was a long time before Louis sent a message. Coco, why are you at the hospital? Are you feeling unwell? Wasn't this question a bit too late? He forgot to ask yesterday why I appeared at his wedding venue. I shook my head, laughed self-deprecatingly, and then blocked all his contacts. Louis still learned about my pregnancy news. Mandy looked apologetic. Coco, I'm really sorry. I'll definitely teach Sam a lesson when I get back. Sam on the other end of the phone said, Coco, you two have been together for so long, give Louis a chance, also give the child a chance. Mandy scolded and snatched the phone from me, cursing at Sam. What Louis did is unforgivable. If it were me, I'd break his arms. Funny thing, Mandy is my best friend, Sam is Louis's childhood friend. Their marriage was actually arranged by us. They got their marriage certificate a few days ago, but they were still missing a wedding ceremony. And Louis and I, after 7 years of toil, ended up like this in the end. Louis still came. Running, sweating profusely, with an anxious look on his face. When he saw me still outside the operating room, his brow suddenly relaxed. He pulled me tightly into his arms, holding me close, as if afraid that if he let go, I would disappear. Coco, I was wrong, don't be impulsive, can we have a good talk? There was a faint smell of smoke on him. His father, Louis Sr., died of lung cancer, so he rarely smokes. Only when he's really stressed will he have a cigarette. These days, he had been running around, looking for medical help for Jenny. People started asking me about my health. They were asking me if everything was okay. These people really thought I could make Louis so worked up? It's ridiculous. What was even stronger than the smoke smell was the scent of jasmine. A few days ago in the hospital, when I was near Jenny, I smelled that familiar fragrance. It reminded me of our second year together. It was also the 5th year since we first met. His father passed away, followed by some financial problems with the company. During that time, Louis couldn't sleep all night. I was worried about his health, so I asked the doctor to prescribe some Chinese herbal medicine to calm his mind. I even took half a day off to make the soup for him. That day, I stayed with that pot of soup. It got very late, but all I got was a sentence, "Coco, I want to be alone for a while, to clear my mind. Don't worry about me." After a few days, he came back, and he had that jasmine scent on him. Turns out, at that time, he went to see Jenny. She was his only emotional support. What's even funnier is that when I asked him why he smelled like that, he handed me a bottle of perfume, "A gift for you. I tried it at the store and thought you might like it." He remembered to bring me a gift when he went out to clear his mind. I thought he must really love me. All the previous unpleasantness seemed to disappear. During that time, our relationship progressed rapidly. He always wanted to be close to me, burying his face in my neck. However, today I finally understood his intentions. He didn't really like me that much. He just liked the jasmine scent on me. Unknowingly, I had become a substitute for Jenny in his eyes. A poor substitute. Apart from that scent, we had nothing in common. I pushed myself out of his arms and slapped him hard. He stood there in a daze, covering his face, looking bewildered. Mandy looked at me, "Coco, how are you?" I covered my mouth and rushed to the bathroom. I vomited intensively, as if I was trying to cough up my heart, liver, and lungs. Mandy handed me a bottle of water and kept patting my back to help me catch my breath. "How did you end up throwing up like this? This is truly unbearable." Louis stood by the door, his face showing a hint of pity. Several red fingerprints stood out on his fair cheeks. I glared at him with hatred. "Do you know how nauseating you are to me? You deliberately chose that perfume, didn't you? The same scent as Jenny's." Of course, he knew what I was talking about. In an instant, his face turned pale. What was he thinking when he did all this? Didn't he find it nauseating himself? "Coco, listen to my explanation." At that time, I didn't understand. I thought that scent made me feel at ease. Later, I realized that it was you who brought me comfort. "Coco, I really want to marry you." I sneered. "Okay, here's the deal. Choose between kicking Jenny out of our lives, or setting clear boundaries between us. From now on, you won't appear in front of me." Louis seemed to hesitate. Mandy protested. "What are you hesitating for? Of course, choose Coco. You've known each other for 7 years and been together for 4 years. Have you forgotten all of that?" But Louis didn't see it that way. He muttered to himself, "But she's dying. Coco, she's dying. She was a ballet dancer, but she had ALS. Do you know that kind of despair?" His words seemed to mock me. Jenny only lost her life, while what I lost was love. How ridiculous. "Louis, but you're my boyfriend. Are you pitying her to the extent of marrying her? Pitying her to the point of disregarding my feelings and leaving me time and time again to go to her? Do you not understand whether you're pitying her or still emotionally attached to her? Using ALS as an excuse countless times to cover his unresolved emotions. How stubborn." Louis remained silent. He just clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't utter a word. At that moment, a ringing phone broke the deathly silence. Louis took out his phone. The voice on the other end was frantic, someone shouting, "Hurry, come over, Jenny is attempting suicide. She doesn't want to live." He panicked instantly. And at that moment, the nurse called me into the operating room. In fact, he had already made his decision. I laughed and said, "Go on, but don't actually die. You'll end up hating me for the rest of your life if you do. Being hated by someone like him is quite a disservice." Louis looked at me, eyes pleading. "Coco, promise me, wait for me to come back before making a decision? I'm the child's father, we'll discuss it together." I tugged at the corner of my lips. I dug my nails viciously into my palm. These 7 years, let's just say they went to the dogs. Another phone call. The urgency on the other end was palpable. Mandy scolded, "Louis, do you even have a conscience anymore?" The visible anxiety on his face, he was probably genuinely afraid that Jenny might really be gone. Mandy scolded, "Jenny is just a fraudster, can't you see through her tricks?" How could he not see through them? Louis wasn't stupid. He was just indulging. He was just afraid of the 1 in a million chance that Jenny might jump from a high building. "Coco, wait for me to come back, wait for me to come back so we can make a decision." I didn't say anything, and he turned to Mandy, "Mandy, I beg you, look after her for me, don't let her go in." Mandy cursed, "Look after her yourself, are you even a man anymore?" I told him to wait for a moment. Then, I twisted the bottle cap off, poured the remaining half bottle of water onto his head. "Louis, we're done, don't come looking for me anymore." Water droplets snaked down his face, dripping onto the ground with a silly look. Some droplets splashed into his eyes, stinging and turning them red. He stared at me blankly and murmured, "I'm sorry." Watching him run away, I felt like a failure. Mandy stamped her foot in anger, "That dog of a man." After cursing, she asked me, "Coco, are you okay?" "I'm fine." I never thought he would choose me in the first place. Even if he did choose me and Jenny was completely out of our lives, we couldn't return to what we once had. Once a mirror is broken, it can't be put back together. Before entering the operating room, I sent him a few messages. "If you're willing, there will be many people willing to have a child with you. But in this world, there's only one Jenny." I wanted him to remember that this child was killed by him and Jenny. I wanted him to remember when he lay on my stomach and asked, "Coco, do you prefer a boy or a girl?" He was the one who wanted a child, but he was also the one who gave up on the child. To kill someone's heart, that's all it takes. The surgery was soon over. When I woke up, Sam was there too. I suddenly remembered something. "Sam, there are 2 rings in my bag, please return them to Louis." After all, those wedding rings were just random choices. Louis was thinking about Jenny at the time, not putting his heart into it. I didn't care about those things either. Sam nodded and left. Mandy sat beside me. "Coco, Louis isn't worth it." I knew that she deliberately leaked the news of my pregnancy to Sam. Letting go of those 7 years was not easy. She thought that it was just because of Jenny's existence that there were misunderstandings between Louis and me. But she didn't know that they had a wedding ceremony. She also didn't know that because of Jenny, Louis left me time and time again. But now, she fully understood. Sam sent her a video. Mandy didn't avoid me and directly clicked on it. In the video, Louis was holding Jenny in his arms. They embraced and wept together. She said, "I don't want to stay in the hospital anymore, it's stuffy here, I don't like it here." Louis agreed to everything she said. She added, "I want to see the world, I want to dance ballet again, I want." She choked up. Louis kept saying, "Okay." He closed his eyes, tears sliding down his cheeks. Fate had been so cruel to this ill-fated couple. Watching it made me sick to my stomach. Mandy showed me the video to force me to make a tough decision. She was always clear-headed. After the observation period ended, Sam and Mandy sent me back home together. As soon as we got into the car, Louis appeared. He was holding the ring box I returned, looking somewhat dazed. "Coco, did you really get rid of our child?" Mandy frowned. "Don't act like a victim, you had a hand in this, didn't you?" I asked softly, "What about Jenny?" Is she asleep? Otherwise, why would you be here? Louis didn't answer, which was as good as acknowledging it. I smiled. If you're so devoted, then go die with her. Don't come before me again. And at that, cracks appeared in his vacant expression. Pain, sadness, guilt, all leaked out from this crack. His eyes were bloodshot. I didn't speak anymore. The pain in my lower abdomen was severe. Even breathing had to be done cautiously. Mandy, filled with anger, scolded harshly, "Clear your heart, only then can the next person who moves in feel comfortable. Why don't you understand such a simple truth? Louis, Coco has been by your side for 7 years. What about that Jenny? She abandoned you, and you still eagerly go after her. Are you demeaning yourself? Sincerely wasted your affections, bad luck." Louis did not retort. Mandy tried to close the car door, but he reached out to stop it, saying, "Coco, she will leave our lives." Mandy rolled her eyes, scoffed, "You just said you wanted to travel the world with her? So, you lied to the first one to deceive the second one? Louis, you're quite greedy. I'm going to close the door now. If my hand gets caught, I won't be able to take care of your old flame." Louis stood firm, not letting go no matter how Mandy scolded him. Sam came down from the driver's seat, trying to persuade gently, "You better leave. What you did was despicable. Don't force your buddy to punch you." Louis stared straight at me, opened a ring box, picked out a female ring, and handed it to me, saying, "We can go back to how we were in the beginning. We can get married, we can still have children." Sam shook his head and proceeded to remove Louis's fingers one by one, trembling. Louis looked at me. His plea was almost overflowing. The car started. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Louis stood still, watching me leave for a long time. He knew the consequences when he decided to leave me. Just putting on a mournful appearance to show his depth of emotions. Following where Mandy's gaze pointed, she sneered, "What a show." In the following days, I focused on taking care of myself in the rental house. Mandy often came to visit. She said, "Louis is pestering Sam every day, asking for your address. I'm fed up." I smiled and continued eating the orange pudding in my hand. One day, I received a call from Jenny. She wanted to meet and talk. I agreed eagerly. When I arrived at the coffee shop, she was already seated. Setting aside our grievances, Jenny was the kind of girl who would impress anyone. She was truly beautiful. She said, "Throughout these years, you have taken care of Louis. Do you know the impression you give right now? Just like a proud thief, clearly knowing that you are stealing from others, yet feeling no shame, but rather feeling pleased with oneself. Quite shameless." Unburdening some thoughts I couldn't keep to myself, Jenny stirred her coffee, her face showing no sign of irritation. Matters of the heart are different than gardening. I'm dying, so I gave up everything to get it back. If you have to blame someone, blame me for giving you 7 years, but you still haven't captured his heart. When she said that, chin raised, a victorious smile on her face. It seemed she truly believed that her death would forever seal Louis's love for her. No one could replace her. Amused, I said, "When you're dying, what can you still hold on to? If you have the ability, make sure Louis can't marry without you, die together with him." "Jenny, I know the living can't compete with the dead. But after you die, can you guarantee he won't meet someone like you again?" She knew Louis's advantages better than me. Exceptional looks, abundant assets. It was easy to attract a constant stream of admirers. Her smile froze on her face. I continued inciting, "Guess what, after you die, will he be yearning for someone who's been dead for years, or someone like me who's within his reach but he can't have?" I took a sip of my bitter coffee. "Jenny, you know better than me how weak Louis is. Is he yearning for you, or clinging to you?" She pressed her lips tight, not uttering a word. It seemed she couldn't figure it out herself. Dying beautifully in his arms, perhaps he would remember you longer. After leaving this piece of advice, I got up and left. She was like a fading rose. When on the verge of death, greedily trying to absorb others' love to prove her existence and significance. It's quite sad. They continued to compose their earth-shattering love story beyond life and death. No longer a concern to me. After resting for a while, I accepted a headhunter's invitation and joined a new company. This city, neither too big nor too small, was enough to make it difficult to reunite with people you bid farewell to. It was quite silly of me. Back when I just got together with Louis, I resigned from my job to help him. I returned to my field of expertise once his career stabilized, which disrupted my professional plans, despite being a valuable work experience. Setting aside feelings, looking back now, it truly was a waste of time. The following months passed uneventfully. One day, Mandy came to deliver wedding invitations. Due to various reasons, their wedding kept getting postponed. Finally, it found a place in that winter. Mandy asked me, "Louis will also come, do you mind? If you do, I'll have Sam sort him out." Sam and Louis have known each other for a long time. They had agreed to be each other's best man. Of course, the wedding shouldn't be affected because of me. I shook my head. You both should enjoy your wedding however you like. The wedding day arrived quickly. Louis, as the best man, followed behind Sam to pick up Mandy. He looked handsome in his suit, just like the first time we met. He probably doesn't remember, but I do. It was an autumn day. I was sitting in the pavilion on the back hill of the school, suddenly missing my mom. If she were here, she would definitely cook me braised pork. And after I finished eating, she would push me to keep working hard. But she's no longer here. I stood at the top of the mountain. There was a moment when I felt like jumping off regardless. And at that moment, I saw Louis. At that time, he had just succeeded in his business, looking sharp in his suit and full of vigor. He stood by my side and casually said, "This is the best spot for the school's view, you can see the rainbow from here." I followed his gaze and indeed saw a rainbow. It was so beautiful and enchanting. I suddenly felt relieved, as if the heavy weight on my chest wasn't so heavy anymore. It might have been just an offhand remark, but I remembered it for many years. It wasn't until 3 years later that I met him again. It was followed by 7 years of entanglement. Unlike that year, he now looked exhausted. He saw me too. The atmosphere was lively, but he just stood there, motionless, gazing at me with complex eyes. I turned to the side, helping Mandy adjust her dress, trying to avoid his gaze. Sam carried Mandy downstairs. There were many people. A child accidentally pushed me, and as I seldom wore high heels, I suddenly felt unsteady. Just as I was about to fall, Louis caught me. In that moment of physical contact, I smelled that mix of cigarette smoke and jasmine fragrance. A familiar sense of nausea surged up. After steadying myself, I pushed him away forcefully. "Don't touch me." He took a few steps back, leaning against the railing, barely maintaining his balance. His eyes downcast, a moment of dumbfoundment, a hurt expression. There were goosebumps on the places he had touched. "Watch your step, Coco," his voice was as gentle as ever. The tone made it seem like we had some kind of relationship. I ignored him and turned to go downstairs. Upon reaching the hotel, I realized Jenny was also there. Sitting in a wheelchair, her face plain, her lips slightly pale, still with that pitiful appearance. She softly called out, "Louis." Louis frowned imperceptibly but still went towards her. Mandy looked at Sam beside her. Sam hurried to clarify, "I didn't invite her." He glanced at me. Probably afraid that Louis would be snatched away. After all, a thief fears another thief the most. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm no thief." Sam shrugged. "People with dirty minds think everyone else is dirty." Mandy sneered. "Fine, if she has no shame, then I'll be blunt too." Soon, it was time. The background music of Love Story played. Mandy, dressed in a white wedding gown, walked slowly towards Sam. I stood below the stage, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. At some point, Louis walked up to me. He handed me a tissue. I didn't take it. It was then that I noticed the wedding ring on his ring finger. It looked pretentious. He didn't care when he chose it, but he refused to take it off after we broke up, pretending to be sentimental. Jenny wheeled herself over. Louis, we never exchanged rings that day. Louis didn't respond, turning to look at me. It seemed like he wanted to see a hint of sorrow and reluctance on my face. But he was destined to be disappointed. I stared at the newlyweds embracing on stage, smiling broadly, goading them to share a kiss. Louis looked down. The people on stage should also include us, right? His voice was soft, drowned out in the crowd in an instant. But I heard it. Jenny heard it too. Her lips trembled. She knew well that when Louis referred to us, he meant me and him. Mandy had once proposed to have a wedding involving 4 people. At that time, everyone's relationship was good, so naturally, the proposal passed unanimously. I never expected Louis to still remember such a thing. It was truly nauseating. I took a few steps to the side. Then, a bouquet of flowers accurately hit Jenny on the head. Mandy took the microphone from the MC. Why did it hit you on the head? I recall you were married before, right? So obsessed with marriage that you stole someone else's fiancé. You didn't even get the certificate, just wore a wedding dress and forced him to have a wedding with you. Upon hearing this, the guests who were eating lifted their heads, searching for the central figure of the conversation. Once again, I moved to the side. Jenny held the flowers, her face pale. Whispers surrounded us from all directions. Some even took out their phones to record videos. This person is so beautiful, how could she be a mistress? Sam pretended to cough a few times. Mandy winked at me, handing the microphone back to the MC. She was helping me vent my anger. When Jenny had her wedding, I was also maliciously speculated about by her friends. Jenny looked somewhat lost. She instinctively looked up at Louis, seeking help. But he just looked at me, hesitant to speak. Louis. Jenny remained silent. Jenny quickly turned red. Vicious gossip is terrifying. She quickly lowered her head and left in her motorized wheelchair. Unexpectedly, Louis didn't go after her. I didn't marry her, I truly regretted it. She was a woman I had once abandoned. The bit of regret and unrequited love from before had probably long been worn away. Mandy chuckled. Aren't you going after her? She might attempt suicide again later. What if she really dies? I don't want to be an accomplice to murder, huh? Louis gave me a deep look and walked away. Mandy spat. That Jenny has no foresight, just seeing her makes me feel unlucky. Sam hugged her, gently stroking her small belly. Wife, calm down, don't startle the baby. Mandy snorted coldly. In the future, stay away from people like Louis who are unclear about their feelings. Listen to me. Later, I heard that Jenny had disappeared. Mandy was eating cherries washed by Sam, with a disdainful expression on her face. Such a show. She really thinks highly of herself. The more she shows off, the more annoyed Louis will be. I chuckled. She's not showing off, she's scared. I heard that in the middle stage of progressive supranuclear palsy, life becomes basically impossible to take care of. She's afraid that Louis will see her at her ugliest. She wants to die in Louis's memories looking beautiful and glamorous. Instead of tormenting each other, she wants Louis to feel guilty. That way, he will remember her for longer. It seems like she took to heart what I said in the coffee shop that day. Later, Mandy told me again, Louis found Jenny. Due to emotional stress and passive therapy, her illness progressed rapidly. Louis felt extremely guilty and actually wanted to travel the world with her. But his company couldn't afford to stop. Not long after, the company's general manager was replaced. Jenny died that winter. Mandy sighed. Actually, Jenny had it pretty bad too. Fate was jealous of her beauty. If she hadn't done all those scheming, I might have pitied her. I thought to myself, me too. Saying this is not out of saintly concern, but just female empathy. Not long after that, due to wrong decisions, Lewis's company suffered a major blow. He was in a tough spot now. When Mandy told me this news, she smiled and said, "That lousy company should have gone bankrupt long ago. Without my family's cocoa, how could it have thrived?" I nodded repeatedly while reviewing project proposals on the computer. It's a good thing to have gotten out early. Eventually, Lewis came looking for me. In fact, he had found out my address long ago. Some time ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and went downstairs to the bathroom in the dark. Somehow, I glanced downstairs. I happened to see him standing outside my house. The dim light fell on him. His figure looked desolate. I didn't know how long he had been standing there. Cigarette butts surrounded his feet. I quickly pulled down the curtains and didn't look again. This time, he looked much thinner. He was meticulously dressed up, but still couldn't hide the fatigue. He still wore the wedding ring on his ring finger. "Coco, can I come in?" I stood at the door with my arms crossed. "If you have something to say, say it here." Seeing my firm attitude, he didn't insist. "Coco, I miss you a lot." He sighed, his tone filled with sorrow. "The day Jenny died, I wasn't as sad as I thought I would be. But every day without you, I feel incredibly miserable. Coco, I can't live without you. How can I go on without you?" He was naive. I didn't accept this ring back in the hospital that day. And now, it was even more impossible for me to accept it. I retorted, "What, after losing a crush, you finally remembered me as your backup plan?" He may have come to me with some sincerity, but more likely, he saw my value and wanted me to accompany him in his comeback. His downfall was his own doing, he couldn't blame anyone else. Lewis frowned. "Coco, don't be like this isn't like you. Mandy and I have always been on the same wavelength," but he didn't cherish it. He said firmly, "You can't just move on from our 7 years that quickly." I shook my head with a smile. "I can pick up and put down things easily." He was still deceiving himself. "Lewis, do you think everyone is as fickle as you?" He pursed his lips and said, "We never got married." I sarcastically replied, "What's the point of telling me this? Hoping I'll praise you for being faithful and strong? By belittling your love for her, you're trying to magnify the depth of feelings you have for me. Lewis, that makes me sick. Couldn't live without you." Did he say the same thing to Jenny too? I regret that we tangled up for so many years. It wasn't until Jenny returned to her country that I saw his true colors. I pretended to close the door. "Sorry, I have to do my makeup, my boyfriend is waiting for me." Lewis looked surprised. "I don't believe it." "You don't believe it?" I raised an eyebrow, finding him quite ridiculous. "Look downstairs, the one driving the Lamborghini, that's my boyfriend, taller, handsomer, younger than you." He actually walked to the end of the corridor and looked out the window. Then his face turned ashen. I closed the door. Over the phone, the newly arrived intern spoke cheerfully, "Sister, when will I be converted to a regular employee?" My sister had just returned to the country when my husband handed me a divorce agreement, saying our marriage was over. My heart felt like it was being torn apart, but I signed it through the pain. Then, carrying his child, I married his archenemy. For years later, he looked at the kid who was a mini version of himself calling his rival dad. His eyes turned red. The pregnancy test showed 2 lines. Before I could be happy, David threw a piece of paper in my face. "Cherry, let's get a divorce. Sign this agreement, and I'll give you an extra 20 million. I looked at the well-dressed, cold-faced man in front of me and couldn't nod. David was getting impatient. When we got married, we signed a contract. Our marriage term is 3 years, it ends in 1 month. If you don't agree now, the contract will end automatically in a month. But then, you won't get a dime of the extra 20 million. I took a deep breath. "David, what if I told you I was pregnant?" I admit I was desperate. Even at this point, I was trying to use the child to keep David. David's family didn't have many heirs, so for the kid's sake, maybe he'd give up the divorce. But David's next words chilled me. I had a vasectomy. The kid can't be mine. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. David was my only man. If it wasn't his, whose was it? When someone doesn't believe you, any explanation is useless. David left. I stared blankly at the divorce agreement. My marriage to David was messy. 3 years ago, the one supposed to marry David was my sister. But she left the country close to the wedding to chase true love. To keep the cooperation between our families, my family had me marry in her place. David's family agreed for the sake of face. I had a crush on David for 7 years, so I didn't refuse. The only unwilling person was David. I didn't know what other people's wedding nights were like. On mine, David tossed me a contract, the same 3-year marriage contract. After 3 years, no matter my wishes, the marriage would end automatically. I felt lost and pained at the time. But I didn't give up. I thought if I treated David well, he'd warm up to me. My sister was abroad, and I was by his side. One day, he'd see my worth. For 3 years, I cared for him meticulously. He had stomach issues, I studied recipes. He had headaches and trouble sleeping, I learned acupuncture. In hindsight, I was too naive. Who would fall for a nanny? Forget it, we were just torturing each other. I trembled, trying to sign the divorce papers. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was my mom. Cherry, your sister is back. She's on the afternoon flight. Tonight, come home with David for a family dinner. My mom sounded unusually happy. I spoke, my voice hoarse. Why did she come back suddenly? My mom sighed. I always felt that guy was no good, but your sister insisted on marrying him. Sure enough, after they married, his true nature showed. He fooled around with other women even when your sister was pregnant, leading to her miscarriage. She's back, so she must have figured it out. That's good. Right, don't bring up the past when you see her. Don't upset her. My mom's voice droned on, but I wasn't listening anymore. I suddenly realized why David was so eager for a divorce. Jane was back. My head spun, flooding with strange thoughts. I felt like I was living in a book. Jane was the main character, and I was the supporting role. I fell for David and married him, but gave up when the heroine returned. Later, Jane couldn't have kids. I gave up my child to them and watched them live as a happy family. I was shocked. Was I losing my mind? In that moment, I realized I no longer loved David. I put down the pen, refusing to sign. Why should I step aside just because Jane's back and let them have their happy ending? Before the divorce, I'd make them uncomfortable. I'd be a villainous supporting character. I took a cab to Cherry's house. David and Jane arrived together. Jane looked more worn out compared to 3 years ago, not as lively. But still, she was the center of attention wherever she went. Dad and Mom surrounded her with concern. It had rained, Jane was dry, but David's sleeve was wet. I could imagine he had sheltered her under the umbrella, letting the rain drench him. With David, he always walked ahead while I followed. People can't compare, right? I pushed down my disappointment and walked to David, worried. Honey, how did your clothes get wet? I clung to David's arm affectionately. Jane's gaze shot over, her eyes vacant. David tried to pull away, but I hugged him tight. Your clothes are wet, you'll catch a cold. You're the backbone of the company. You can't get sick. Let's go upstairs and change. Watching the vein pulse on his forehead, I could see his struggle to maintain his composure. But still preserving his image as a husband, he followed me upstairs. The moment we were in the room, he shoved me away. Stop clinging to me. You're my husband. Why can't I hang on to your arm? David took a deep breath. Did you sign the divorce agreement? No. I'm pregnant. I told you I had a vasectomy. Are you sure the doctor didn't scam you? You're the only man I've been with these 3 years. Don't try to weasel out of it, I said coldly. David looked at me with a livid face. Cherry, what happened to you? For the past 3 years, I've always been the perfect wife and mother in front of David. Gentle and considerate, always listening to him. He had never seen me this harsh and prickly. In reality, the gentle and considerate me was just a facade. I'm the type who never lets things go. If I can't make him fall for me, I'll make sure he bleeds. I need to make up for these years of humility and pain. I folded my arms and looked at him. What's wrong with me? At least I'm better than someone who doesn't even recognize his own trousers. David was so angry he couldn't even speak. Downstairs, I reverted to being gentle. I sat next to David, acting cute. Honey, I want some fish, but it's too far. Can you get it for me? Honey, my water's empty. Get me more, please. I kept bossing David around. David and Jane both looked upset. Maybe Jane realized that the guy who used to follow her around is now someone else's husband. Jane made an excuse about being tired and went upstairs halfway through dinner. David couldn't take it anymore and went to the bathroom. Cherry, your sister just went through a breakup. Acting like that with David might upset her, my mom scolded me quietly. I almost laughed. This family has always revolved around Jane. When Jane ran away, they made me marry in her place, never caring about my happiness. Now that Jane's back, she's all they care about. They don't think there's anything wrong with my husband being nice to Jane. Jane is like the main character of this world, and with her around, I'm always just a background character. No one cares about me, no one thinks about me. I should have been used to it by now. I lifted my head, hiding the sadness in my eyes. With a pitiful look, I said, Mom and Dad, I'm pregnant. That's why. Before I could finish, I suddenly heard the sound of a glass breaking. Raising my head, I saw Jane standing empty-handed, her face filled with shock. David ran out of the bathroom, grabbed my hand, and rushed us out. Back home, David glared at me furiously. I really am pregnant, isn't it worth mentioning? Ignoring David's murderous glare, I went to the bathroom, recalling Jane's shock and David's anger. I suddenly felt a strange satisfaction. Maybe I do have a knack for playing the villainess after all. The next day, I slept in until it was bright outside. It was already 8 o'clock. I walked out of the bedroom and saw David sitting on the sofa, looking furious. David's a really picky guy, even with his coffee. Normally, I'd prep his breakfast and coffee for him. But now, I didn't feel like catering to him. Sleeping in felt great. Hungry? I asked. David didn't answer, but his stomach growled. I'll order some food. David looked at me in disbelief. Before the delivery arrived, David slammed the door and left. I couldn't help but give myself a thumbs up. Good thing I didn't order for him. In the afternoon, while getting a spa treatment, I got a call from David's assistant. Cherry, the company cafeteria food doesn't suit David's tastes, so he hasn't eaten. Oh right, I looked at him blankly. Stop calling me that. It's disgusting. Get lost. Cherry, why are you suddenly so hot-headed? But his eyes filled with an inexplicable tenderness. That's the you I know. What he said was so baffling. I just thought he was being slick and stepped right on Simon's foot. Hearing him yelp in pain, I left satisfied. I'm definitely getting a divorce from David. Plus, I want an extra $2 million. I'm dragging this out just to discuss David and Jane. But the child in my belly. I hesitated for a few days and finally decided to get rid of it. I made an appointment and went to the hospital for a series of tests. The doctor looked at the report. Cherry, your physical condition, you can't have an abortion. I was shocked. Actually, last night I dreamt about that book again. In the dream, I was like a reader, flipping through the book. David is the male lead. Jane is the female lead. I'm a side character. And Simon is the villain. Simon's end is miserable. After bankruptcy, he's reduced to picking up trash on the streets. As for the abortion, it was exactly like the plot in the book. The doctor also told me I couldn't have an abortion. If I insisted, it could be life-threatening. I was already a bit hesitant anyway. After all, this is my bloodline. With the doctor saying this, I decided to keep the child. However, I'm not going to give the baby to David and Jane like in the book. I'll raise the child on my own. As soon as I walked out of the doctor's office, I saw Simon again. Simon looked at me, then glanced at the obstetrics sign. Cherry, you're pregnant? Why didn't you tell me? I could have come with you to the hospital. I'm busy, but I'd always make time for you and the baby, Simon said with deep emotion, his words filled with hidden meanings. I stepped on Simon's foot again, this time grinding my heel. Watching his handsome face twist in pain, I left satisfied. Joy turned to misfortune. Maybe it was seeing Simon suffer. I got too happy and accidentally fell down the steps. Instinctively, I held my belly. Vaguely, I felt someone rush towards me. Then, I was picked up. Doctor! Doctor! Come quickly! It seemed like Simon's voice. But why did he sound so anxious? I fainted shortly after. When I woke up, I saw Simon sitting by my bed. He was on a low stool with his long legs awkwardly placed. Noticing I woke up, Simon narrowed his eyes at me. Awake? Cherry, do you have an underdeveloped cerebellum or something? Can't even walk without falling? Simon mocked me mercilessly. I was sure that the Simon who anxiously called for the doctor was just my imagination. Suddenly, Simon's demeanor changed. Cherry, your face looks terrible. Are you hurt? Let me blow on it for you. In that instant, a figure stepped between us. David grabbed Simon's hand. His face was extremely ugly. This is my wife, David said coldly, wanting to crush Simon with his gaze. So Cherry has a husband? I thought she came alone for a checkup because her hubby was dead, Simon retorted. David pressed his lips together and glared at Simon. Simon wasn't afraid at all. Get lost, David said coldly. David, all you can say is that one word? Are you a broken record? Simon mocked him, pushing David to the brink of explosion before finally leaving. My mood lifted. Even though Simon is annoying, he's kind of cute when he angers David. David suddenly glared at me, his face extremely displeased. I touched my face and realized I was smiling. Simon wants everything of mine. He's good to you because you're my wife. Don't flatter yourself, David said coldly. At that moment, a brilliant idea popped into my head to really piss off David. With a troubled expression, I said, what should I do? I think I've fallen for Simon, David. I'll sign the divorce papers when I get back. Sure enough, my words made David's face turn ashen. Back home, I searched for the divorce papers but couldn't find them. I called David. Where are the divorce papers? There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. I don't know. Having been with David for 3 years, I knew him well. He was lying. He hid the divorce papers. He had forced me to sign them, and now he's hiding them so I can't. Seems like David doesn't care for Jane that much after all. For the sake of his pride, he chose not to divorce for now. But I didn't mind. David won't hold out for long. In the following days, I carried on with life, eating and drinking as I pleased. I also planned my post-divorce life. I'll find a small town, open a little shop, and live a simple life. Suddenly, I got a call from my mom asking me to come home. When I returned, I saw my mom, dad, and Jane all sitting there, looking serious. As soon as she saw me, my mom came over and grabbed my hand. "Cherry, I know you haven't been happy these years with David. He treats you poorly, like a maid." She looked heartbroken. I suddenly wanted to laugh. So she knew all along. I used to think she just didn't care. Like when Jane got a small bump, they rushed her to the hospital. But I had a fever all night, and no one noticed. What's worse, she knew but didn't care. Both daughters, but Jane was her precious treasure while I was just a burden. "Cherry, maybe you should get a divorce." If she's suggesting a divorce, it's definitely not for my sake. She must have other motives. I glanced at Jane. "Yeah, David never liked you anyway. Why torture each other?" Jane said. I spoke up. "David likes you." "So, Jane, you mean we get divorced, and you marry David?" Jane didn't respond, but it was clear that's what she meant. I looked at my mom and dad. They clearly had the same idea. No expectations, no disappointment. I rubbed my belly. "If we get divorced, what happens to my child?" "Cherry, stop pretending. The child isn't David's. David didn't call you out to save your face, so don't push your luck," Jane said bluntly. Looks like Jane couldn't wait. "5 million, I whispered. Jane froze for a moment. "What?" "Give me 5 million, and I'll divorce David." Mom and Dad spoiled Jane. Everything in Cherry's house was meant for her. 5 million was nothing to her. I had to raise my child alone. The more money, the better. When David finds out he was sold for 5 million, he'd be pissed.